George had a conviction for a sex attack in the 1980s. He also discovered that there was a reference on his file to the fact he'd been arrested in the grounds of one of the royal palaces with a length of rope around his shoulder and a knife. And the palace concern was the one where the Prince of Wales and Princess Diana were then living. And they found that he'd been stopped by police in the 1990s for following women. Nobody at Fulham Police Station actually knew anything about him, interestingly. Barry George turned out to be a very long way down the suspect list.
He was described as a loner. And he was almost a usual, one of the usual suspects, because the police hadn't found anybody and they came back to him.
Barry George had been reported to the police in the early days following Jill's murder.
A detective constable called John Gallagher discovered a message about a man called Busara, which had come in from Hafad, which was a local drop-in centre for disabled people, to Barry George.
Barry George often claimed he was the cousin of British musician Freddie Mercury, using the alias Barry Balsara.
To some extent, he was living in a fantasy world, especially in relation to Queen and music and all the rest of it. But this is it. It was an overtly fantastical world where, he wasn't hiding away.
He also took the name Paul Gadd, which was Gary Glitter's real name. He also used the name Steve Powers, who was an SAS soldier, took part in the Iranian Embassy siege, and he also used the name Lee Majors, who was a stuntman and Hollywood star at one stage. And he was actually convicted for several offences under some of these aliases, bizarrely. But it's just an example of the sort of fantasy life he led. And for the police, at the time that they were looking at him as a strong suspect, that all added to the mix.
I think most people who lived in Fulham were aware of Barry George wandering around the streets. He's quite distinctive. He was somebody who probably needed a little bit more help than he had in the community.
But further investigations into police records during the early days of their inquiry revealed more.
By now, police were getting very concerned because they also knew, looking through their records, that a local taxi firm had also called the police soon after the shooting to say they were concerned about a man who kept coming in and seemed to be trying to build up what, as it appeared to the police, to be constructing an alibi for himself.
Timings were crucial, of course, because the killing took place at around 11:30 in the morning. Question, where was he? And his case was that he'd attended at a local agency, Hafad, housing agency, and that he'd gone home and changed clothing, and he'd gone to a park and gone to get a taxi somewhere else. And so his defensive alibi was that he wasn't in the road when it happened.
Detectives decided to place him under surveillance and carefully monitored his every move.
We had access to a whole load of black and white photographs taken of him in the street. My recollection is that those photographs didn't take it anywhere. In other words, yes, he's looking a bit furtive in the street, because he always looks a bit furtive.
The investigation revealed that Barry George had a history of following and photographing women.
There was one case of, I think it was a woman in a bus queue, and then he got on the bus with her. Now, this is very overt behaviour. In other words, it is somebody who is, I think, desperately anxious to create a relationship which he hasn't got with somebody. And so it's an unhappy situation, and it's very unpleasant, I suspect, for any woman who is on the receiving end of this treatment. And in a sense, he needs help if that's what was going on. But this is a long way away from the nature of this crime, which wasn't about following Jill Dando around in order to create a relationship.
The psychological profilers were talking about somebody who might well fantasize, who might, for example, have fantasized over Princess Diana, somebody who'd had difficult relationships in the past, which Barry George had had. All of these things added to the list of things that ticked off that made him a very strong suspect, and then eventually the strongest suspect.
Over a year after Jill's murder, and based on their findings, Met Police were confident there was sufficient evidence to arrest Barry George.
4 unarmed officers, or that is what Scotland Yard still maintains, arrested him, and they began a search of his home. And that is when things became interesting.
That search.
Barry George's flat was absolutely stacked to the ceiling with old newspapers. You could barely get in it. So he, again, might be regarded as an oddball for keeping all these newspaper cuttings and so on. But, so, yes, there was a sort of obsessive side to this man because he collected things. But I know there's people who collect things. Maybe not to that extent. Obsessive of Jill Dando? Absolutely not. You know, you would think that if he was obsessed with Jill Dando, he would have accumulated quite a library, because she was in newspapers very regularly. None of it was cut out, none of it was highlighted. There were no notes anywhere suggesting he was wanting to find out where Jill Dando was at any one time.
Detectives removed various items.
They took a coat that he'd worn and sent it for examination. They developed about 100 reels of film which he had, which showed that he'd been stalking around about, I think it's 480 women.
Police investigation also revealed that he had an interest in firearms. Barry George was interviewed at Hammersmith Police Station in London.
This is a man who originally had told the police that he had nothing to do with guns and hadn't had anything to do with guns for quite a long time. But police found that, for example, he tried to join the parachute regiment, the TA section of it. He tried to join the regular army. He belonged for a short time to a gun club in Kensington. He'd had a number of starter pistols. A former neighbour of his had seen him with a weapon.
After he was arrested, it was plain he did have an interest in firearms. I mean, he didn't have the weapon that is said to have been used here, but he did have an interest in weapons. But that doesn't mean that he's the murderer.
He said he had nothing to do with Jill Dando. He didn't know Jill Dando lived in the area. He'd never met her, never seen her, and denied any link at all to the murder.
Barry George was asked to take part in an ID parade.
He refused to go on an ID parade, and so the ID parades were done on a laptop with potential witnesses being shown a series of images of possible suspects plus innocent people, and picking them out from a laptop display.
There was a neighbour living right next door to Jill Dando who was looking out on the road, and a man living opposite. They both saw somebody departing from the gate area where this had happened, and they both went to identification parades, and neither of them picked out Barry George. In fact, either one or both picked out someone else.
Whilst Barry George was being held in custody, forensics made an interesting discovery.
Everything gelled for the police when they were told by the forensic science experts that they had found a very, very tiny trace of firearms discharge in the pocket of the coat that had been taken away. It was said to measure around about 1/1000th of an inch. It was tiny. But the interesting thing about it was that the chemical composition, according to the scientists, is exactly the same as the bullet which had killed Jill Dando.
They also found a single fibre at the crime scene that matched the material of a pair of trousers owned by prime suspect Barry George. On the 29th of May 2000, Barry George was formally charged for the murder. Were Metropolitan Police finally going to get justice for Jill? Ease at the verdict.
From that point on, people began to get behind Barry George to campaign for a fresh look at the case, and arguing that there was something wrong here, that it was a miscarriage of justice. His defence managed to mount an appeal. As the years went on and Barry George remained in prison, a campaign built up to get him free.
After an appeal and 8 years in jail, Vital new forensic research cast doubt over the significance of the gunpowder traces.
The Court of Appeal argued that if the evidence in the pocket had been found a day or so after the murder, then it was key evidence. There was a link. But because there had been such a long period of time, it was no longer safe to assume it was linked to the murder. There were also points made about the fibre which was found on Jill Dando. The clothing she'd been wearing had been left at the scene for quite a long time after the shooting, so it's perfectly possible for that fibre, which is fairly common, to have come from another source and not from Barry George's trousers.
The forensic evidence was deemed unsafe. The Court of Appeal set a date for the retrial.
The prosecution maintained that he was an obsessionist with a fantasy about guns and a grudge against the BBC. The defence simply said, what we have here is the police have arrested the local nutter. And that was the phrase used by William Clegg QC, who now appeared for Barry George. And the jury accepted that there wasn't sufficient evidence.
After 8 years in prison, Barry George was finally cleared of the murder of Jill Dando.
Because I'm a firm believer that the truth will out in the end and justice will be done, but some people have to wait far longer than he did.
So, if Barry George didn't kill Jill Dando, who did? This is 2019. We're 6 days away from the new year 2020. When will her murder case be solved? It's an unsolved murder case in England of one of the most popular television news reporters who's a local star. My name is Sammy. Please subscribe, share, and like my podcast. Please hit the bell at the end of this video for your subscription, your subscriber. And please tell your social media friends and your real life friends about my podcast. Because we have big changes and big ideas for the year 2020. And like I said before, send me Videoplex. We only just got started. Thank you very much, and season greetings.